Anyway, well, good morning. My name is Tran. Welcome to Humanities Day. Is this the first event of the day for you all? God, I hope so. Because this is a little early for me. I was actually scheduled originally to do an event later in the day, and I just happened to have a friend's wedding that I have to attend in a few hours. So they were good enough to move this, so I hope it wasn't inconvenient for you all. And I think I heard they moved the room too. So everything is against us. And it's so grim outside. But I kind of like this weather at the same. I told you I don't, but I kind of like it too. Anyway, thank you again for being here with me. I'd like to begin by telling you a little bit about myself, since it's apropos to my talk. I've been teaching in the English department here at the University of Chicago, the English department and Committee on Creative Writing for about 6 years. I teach primarily fiction writing. And before that, I spent 7 years teaching and living in Las Vegas, which is the primary setting of my first novel, Dragonfish, which I'll be reading from you for you today after I talk a bit about what I was trying to do in the book, in the novel. Because even though the novel is structured like a crime narrative, a detective fiction, it's very much an immigrant narrative. And I drew upon a little of my own history for that. I was born in Saigon, Vietnam in 1975. And this is, some people coming? And this was 4 months after Saigon fell to the communist government, which finally and irrevocably ended the Vietnam War. And my father, who was a captain in the South Vietnamese Air Force, and therefore fought with the Americans, he had to flee when the communists took control of the city. And so my mother was left to raise for me, she was left to raise me and my sister, who was 2 years older than me, or she's still 2 years older than me. She was left to raise us by herself for about 4.5 years. Because in 1980, my mother bought passage for all three of us on a small fishing boat, which was, made for 20 people maybe, but ended up with about 90 of us, a little over 90 of us. And we spent 6 very difficult days at sea, though we were much luckier than thousands of other Vietnamese quote-unquote boat people who did the same thing, who fled by boat. And many of those, it was hundreds of thousands, but thousands ended up perishing at sea and suffering unspeakable things, and we were very lucky in that sense. And what happened, we were headed to Singapore, but we finally arrived in Malaysia, and they settled us on it's a small, tiny deserted island called Pulau Bidong. And there was a refugee camp on there, and we settled there. That refugee camp, I think, was from like 76 to 89. It stayed open. And we came there in 1980. We stayed there 4 months. And my father eventually, he had settled in America, and he eventually sponsored us and brought us to Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was where I met him for the first time and where I was raised. I lived there for about 20 years. Now, the title of my talk is Noir and the Refugee Experience. But the word I want to focus on is ambiguity. And it's because I've been thinking a lot about this idea of ambiguity over the past year or so, particularly in the context of being a writer and of my own writing itself. And I've been thinking about it for a number of reasons. Firstly, it makes me remember my first foray into writing serious literary fiction in college, when I was at turns trying to be William Faulkner, Toni Morrison, and any writer from the Harlem Renaissance. I think there's a point where a young, ambitious writer goes from writing fiction that moves from dilemma to resolution, to writing fiction that is suddenly aware that resolution is not always possible, and could in fact be a mark of artistic inferiority, artistic simplicity. and even intellectual simplicity. That's what I thought. And this is where I discovered ambiguity, both as a writer and as a person, but especially as a writer, because I thought it was not only a narrative device, but also an artistic point of view. And I thought I was emulating all the writers I'd read in high school and early college. And if you think about it, look at how much more interesting and complex a story becomes when you can interpret it in so many different ways. When you can make things indeterminate, contradictory, and irresolvable. In Ernest Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants, if you've ever read it, the couple is talking about the young girl having an abortion. So does she have the abortion at the end? We can't be sure. There's a cloud in the middle of the story that casts a shadow over the valley. Does it symbolize fertility because it brings rain? Or does it foreshadow the death of her child? And I kept thinking, how wonderful, how cool is it that I can't decide, that we can't decide? But of course, this ambiguity is in a default philosophical mode, which is to say that I didn't make up my mind about things. I wasn't taking a stance in my fiction or imposing myself. And I merely let my authorial indecision become the substance of the work. Basically, in the absence of having anything interesting to say, I settled on ambiguity as a way of hoping for meaningfulness, if that makes sense. And so that begs the question, what kind of ambiguity is meaningful? How do you define that kind of ambiguity? And most importantly, how do you reach for it as a writer, particularly as a fiction writer? And I think as I matured as a person and as a writer, I kind of intuitively came to an answer for this question. I think naturally you become a better writer and a more thoughtful person. You do come to a kind of answer, but I never actually articulated it to myself. And this brings me to the second reason I've been thinking about ambiguity. In the interviews I've done over the past year since the book was published, I'm frequently asked about what I read and wrote as a child. And in answering that question, I realized something that only now seems perfectly obvious to me. And the thing was, my favorite books as a child were the Noir Chronicles by C.S. Lewis. Have you all read those, or at least familiar? Yeah. The Narnia Chronicles by C.S. Lewis. The first one, though it's second in the order of things, but the first one published, and my favorite, was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? And I was really captivated by the premise, which is that you have these four siblings, and they find, the girl finds a portal into another world, and this alien, fantastic world through this magical wooden wardrobe, right? And they eventually, in this new world, they become warriors and kings and queens and remarkable people. And that felt remarkable to me. I was absolutely captivated by that premise, that idea. And I've been writing fiction since the first grade. And so many of the stories I wrote in my youth used that plot line. I kept returning to it again and again. It's what the critic Christopher Booker calls a voyage and return plot, right? And what my characters would do, they would discover an alternate world and end up moving back and forth through these landscapes of normal and alien experience. And sometimes escaping an unsatisfying normal reality and finding a preferable alien reality. And sometimes becoming trapped in that alternate reality to the point that it becomes dangerous. And you're all familiar again with this plot. Alice in Wonderland, uh, Back to the Future is this kind of plot. The Wizard of Oz. Um, you know, this plot you see in storytelling. We've seen in storytelling for a long, long time. And what I realize now was that what I was doing that entire time, all those years, even into my college days, was writing about my experience as an immigrant. My story living as an immigrant. And it's important to emphasize that it's more specifically a refugee experience, because the refugee never quite has a choice in the matter and is, in a sense, trapped in the new world. When you come to your new world as an immigrant, as a refugee, no matter how old you are leaving behind the world that first made you, right? And no matter how well you adapt to this new and adopted country, your life will always be shadowed, if not weighed down, by the life you left behind and by how you imagined that life could have played out, right? And that often psychic weight can be created by your family, by your parents, by your own memories, or it can be created by the new world that will always, on some level, see you as an outsider, no matter how much it might also accept you. And in that sense, you end up living in a kind of liminal space between the new world and the old world. Never quite belonging to either, never quite knowing which one you want to belong to more. So if you're like me, you also end up imagining a space where you can move fluidly between those worlds, even though you know that in reality that is much more difficult, if not impossible. And essentially that's what I was kind of doing when I was writing those stories. And as a result, you are confronted with a certain visceral ambiguity, an in-betweenness that allows for no measure of absolute clarity or certainty about yourself, your environment, what you desire, what you think you need. And while this might sound like an incredibly uncomfortable space to live in, I would argue, first of all, that it's the space all people live in some degree. Immigrants, I think, just confront it in a more obvious way, as do people who seem obviously different from other people. I would also argue that as a writer, it's an incredibly advantageous and productive state to be in. When you're an outsider looking at the inside, wanting or just curious about what it's like to be on the inside, you inevitably look at it with a more thoughtful, critical, and perceptive eye. When you're already on the inside, you don't necessarily think to do that. You're not moved to engage with the ambiguity of liminal existence. But this ambiguity is what also leads us to see the world through an unexpected lens and with unexpected insight. It's what the poet John Keats called negative capability. When man, he said, is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And basically, Keats believed in pursuing a vision of artistic beauty, even when it leads us into emotional and philosophical uncertainty. Since that uncertainty, that confusion, that half-knowledge is ultimately part of the beauty itself. And he said, and he called it, a mansion of many apartments. If human life is a mansion of many apartments, right, and we move from initial and blissful ignorance into what Keats called the chamber of maiden thought, where the brightness of awakening understanding at first thrills us, but then that maiden thought, that awakening understanding gradually and inevitably dims. It darkens once we realize what he called the burden of mystery in life, which is that it's full of pain, misery, and heartbreak. I'm sorry to be depressing, right? And if we see intellectual and artistic pursuit as a confrontation with this brightness and its inevitable dimming, that leads to countless other, what he called dark passages. We must also explore those dark passages too, while embracing the fact that they might never lead us again to understanding. Does that make sense? And so that brings me to the noir genre itself, and what I was kind of thinking about when I was writing the book. The other question I was always asked in interviews is, why did you choose to write an immigrant novel in the guise of a crime novel, of a noir novel? And to very briefly describe the novel itself, it's a story about a white American police officer from Oakland, a man named Robert, who had a tumultuous marriage to a Vietnamese woman whom he named Susie after his first girlfriend, which is never a good sign. She left him 2 years before the novel begins and has moved to Las Vegas and apparently remarried a Vietnamese gambler named Sonny, who also happens to be a smuggler and an all-around abusive and problematic man. And the thrust of the plot is that as the novel begins, Susie has disappeared and left his new Vietnamese husband, her new Vietnamese husband, intentionally or unintentionally. And so he has blackmailed Robert, the white American police officer, and the protagonist of the novel, into finding her for him in Las Vegas. And the reason behind the blackmail is contained in a flashback that I will read to you in a moment. Now, what I just described to you is the crime narrative in the novel. There is a secondary narrative that is made up of letters that this Vietnamese woman, Susie, is writing to her adult daughter, who is in America. No one knows about this daughter, and she abandoned the daughter 20 years before the beginning of the novel, when they first came to the U.S. And these letters detail their escape from Vietnam by boat, their life on a refugee island off the coast of Malaysia, and that might sound familiar, and how that life intersected, in fact, with this Vietnamese man who is now her new husband. And so after I developed the initial premise of this novel, I started seeing some interesting connections between the noir genre in literature and the Asian diasporic experience. First of all, as the word suggests, noir is about the absence of light, the absence of truth. And it's about the stories that exist in the shadows and are only partially revealed to us, right? And of course, out of that, all the endless and endlessly unanswerable questions that come out of that. If you've read a lot of noir, crime, detective fiction, whatever you want to call it, whether it's Arthur Conan Doyle or Raymond Chandler or the contemporary version that we now see in every airport bookstore, you might see a lineage that goes back to the English and American Romantic movement, from the Gothic narratives of writers like Edgar Allan Poe and Mary Shelley, to poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Lord Byron, and even John Keats, which I just talked about. For, say, example, in the figure like the Byronic hero, it's this brooding loner who roams the land, fights his enemies by himself, hides great misery in his heart, is full of cynicism and vengeful anger, right? But yet is also capable of deep and strong affection. This figure, this Byronic hero, is very similar to the detective that we all know in noir fiction. We often call it an anti-hero as well. It's a version of the anti-hero that we're now very familiar with, especially in TV. Now, one of the reasons that this figure has always been compelling to readers is because he is shrouded, this figure, this Byronic hero, this detective, is shrouded in mystery and appears weighed down, fundamentally affected and therefore shaped by the stories in his past that he is unwilling to tell others, and perhaps is unable to tell others. And this reminds me a lot of the immigrant, of the refugee on a certain level, of the displaced person in an alien land whose only real possession, at least at first, is his or her memory of their homeland, of the life and identity they were forced to leave behind, perhaps permanently. And as I've mentioned, there is a big difference between the immigrant and the refugee, because the latter, the refugee, is deprived of agency. And that absence of power and choice inevitably brings with it an absence of trust and meaning. And while some refugees, of course, are more than willing to share their stories with people, there are many who refuse to, who cannot do it even if they wanted to. And I've always been interested in the reasons why refugees do not tell the stories that they end up carrying around their entire lives in the new country. And I think that ambiguity, those reasons known and unknown, even to the people who carry around these hidden stories, that was always the engine for my novel, whether I knew it or not at first. And if that ambiguity is ultimately meaningful, that meaningfulness comes out of that space between what is concealed or denied and what is unavoidably uncertain and undefined. And if we are to hearken back to the Romantics, the Romantic poets, I'd add that this space is marked by apprehension, perhaps even trauma and horror. And therefore, that is what moves it towards the sublime in that way. So that's a little context for you. And what I'll be reading for you now is an excerpt from the second chapter of the novel. And this is where Robert remembers his first visit to Las Vegas, which, remember, he's never been there. And this was where, this is after he found out that his ex-wife had remarried this Vietnamese man, and that this man has abused her and thrown her down a staircase and broke her arm, right? And so he comes to Las Vegas with this vague notion of vengeance, and he goes to Sonny's sushi restaurant in Chinatown, where he finds instead Sonny's son, whom he ends up calling Junior in his head. And Junior has already figured out his intentions and has warned him to go home and forget the whole matter, right? In a sense, threatening him to go home. But as the scene begins, Robert goes back to the restaurant a second time, again looking for Sonny and for some kind of heroic confrontation. And I'll read for, I think, about 20 minutes and maybe a little more. And afterwards, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to talk to you about anything. I returned to Fuji West at 8 o'clock as the sun was setting. I drove this time. The parking lot was half full, mostly fancy cars, and I immediately spotted the silver Porsche in the back row. Sure enough, it had the right tag. I rechecked the 5-shot in my ankle holster. My hands felt bruised from the hot, dry air. Inside, the restaurant was cool and dark and very zen. Piano music drifted along the ceiling beams overhead. Booth tables with high-backed wooden seats, lighted by small suspended lanterns, lined the walls like confessionals. Candlelit tables filled in the space between the booths and the circular sushi bar, an island at the center of the restaurant manned by 3 hatted sushi chefs in white who resembled sailors. Flanking the bar were 2 enormous aquariums filled with exotic-looking fish staring out calmly at the 20 or so patrons in the restaurant, most of whom easily outdressed me. I asked for a table near the bar and ordered a Japanese beer and told the hostess I was waiting for a friend. I'd barely wet my lips before the Sonny's young Doberman appeared and sat himself across from me, as casually as if I'd invited him. He was now dressed in a charcoal suit set off by another beautiful pink tie, looking very ready to be someone's best man. He waved at a waitress, who swiftly brought him a bottle of Perrier and a glass with a straw. Pouring the Perrier into the glass, he said to me, "So you didn't like my advice?" His voice was gentle but humorless. He sipped his Perrier with the straw like a child. In the aquarium directly behind him, a long brown eel swam slowly through his head. "My business with Sonny is important," I said. "I'm sure it is," he replied, "except my father has no business with you." I drank my beer and tried to hide my surprise. I searched his face for some resemblance of the hard man I'd already envisioned in my head. "So you know who I am," I said. "Miss Hong's friend, Happy, is also a friend of mine," he said. "She recently visited me and mentioned that she had been seeing you. That is, until last month. You stopped taking her calls. She got worried. She told me what you had been planning to do. She didn't know how serious you were, but she wanted to tell me for your sake. She likes you, Mr. Robert, and I suppose she has some womanly notion of saving you. She did not tell Miss Hong," and Miss Hong is Susie's real name. Hong is her real name. "She did not tell Miss Hong, of course, or my father. So only I know that you are here, and that is a good thing." "Because your father's a dangerous man?" I asked. He eyed me sternly, drawing together his dark, handsome eyebrows. He said, "Because my father does not have my patience." The hostess came by and whispered something into his ear, and Sonny Jr. looked to the front of the restaurant, where a large party had arrived, people in suits and dresses. He stood and gestured for a waiter, then gave him and the hostess rapid orders in Vietnamese. He glanced at me distractedly and went on with his instructions. He watched them walk away and continued watching as they saw to the party. His father might have been a poker-playing gangster, or maybe a gangster-playing poker player. But for that moment, Junior seemed nothing more than what he appeared, the young manager of a restaurant. He turned back to me, adjusting his tie, his face once again as calm as the fish. He said to me, "You were a narcotics investigator once, 10 years ago, I believe." I took another swill of my beer. "Good detective work," I said. "You did it for only 2 years, and then returned to being a patrol officer. Why?" "It didn't suit me," I replied. "Why do you want to know?" "Because the answer matters," he said. "You do not strike me as someone who gives up easily." "I didn't give up on anything," I said a little too loudly. His facts were accurate but told a meaningless story. He had no idea how good I was at prying into other people's lives, how tedious and occasionally thrilling the job was, or how enjoying it emptied me because I didn't care to know so much about people I cared nothing for. "It just wasn't my cup of tea," I said. He tried to puzzle me out like he was readying a few more questions, but then he grabbed the linen napkin on the table and stood. He dabbed at his forehead with the napkin, pocketed it, and said, "I have something to show you. It will behoove you to come with me." "I'm guessing this something is not your father?" I said. Instead of answering me, he nodded toward the front of the restaurant. "You're free to go if you want, but I think you'll regret it." I still hadn't moved. "You're the police officer here," he said. "It should be me who's nervous." I felt vaguely embarrassed and downed the rest of my beer before getting up. As I gestured for him to lead the way, I noticed again how much taller I was. On our way to the kitchen, we passed 2 private tatami rooms, each being busily prepared by the staff for the swarm of guests out front. Foolishly or not, the presence of so many people eased my mind. The kitchen was staffed by Mexicans and Asians, all in white uniforms. No one paid us any attention as we walked to the back, toward a door marked office. Junior unlocked it, and once we stepped inside, he relocked it. He approached an enormous door-sized oil painting of a geisha walking up a dark flight of stairs. There was a clock on the wall beside it, which he set to midnight. Then he turned the minute hand 3 revolutions clockwise and 2 revolutions counterclockwise. The painting slowly swung open from the wall like a door, revealing a passageway in a dark descending staircase. He walked down and with a glance over his shoulder said, "It will close again in 10 seconds. Visions of my own doom flitted through my head, but at that point I'd already talked myself into following. If he wanted to lure me into danger, he wouldn't be this obvious about it, even if he figured me for a complete idiot. The kid seemed too smart to underestimate a cop. He really wanted to show me something, and I wasn't ready yet to walk away. We reached a long, dim hallway and passed 6 closed doors, each with a keypad over the knob. At the end, we stopped at a door that was set much farther away from the others. He punched a series of numbers on the keypad, and something clicked. He pushed the door open completely before walking inside. Excuse me. I heard soft oriental music. The room glowed bluish and shimmered. It was no more than 800 square feet, but felt cavernous, with a lofty ceiling and walls of glass surrounding us, behind them water and fish. I had entered a gigantic aquarium. The 3 walls before me each showed the flush faces of 4 separate tanks, framed in quadrants like giant television monitors, their blue-lit waters filled with stingrays and sharks and what looked like piranha and other menacing fish, swimming around beds of coral and white gravel. High above me were 2 ceiling fans, their slow synchronous spinning like the gears of a machine. I noticed in the small video camera perched in the corner, peering down at us. On a large oriental rug in the center of the room stood a black leather couch, 2 dolphin chairs, and a glass coffee table. Sonny Jr. walked to the table and took a cigarette from the pack lying there, lit it casually, and approached the tank of stingrays. I sensed something behind me. Haunting the hallway outside in his oversized bib of an apron was the 7-foot Mexican, his dull Frankenstein face looming beyond the top of the doorframe, nearly severed by it. Junior spoke Vietnamese to him, and he stepped inside, bowing to do so, and propelled me farther into the room until I was standing by the black couch. He untied his apron and let it wilt onto the floor, then closed the door behind him. I don't know why it had taken this long for my nerves to kick in, but as soon as the door clicked shut, I clenched my jaw. It struck me that the Mexican spoke 3 languages, including Vietnamese apparently. And something about this, the fact that he belonged completely to this absurd situation, was both comical and deeply troubling. I said to Junior, "Your father has expensive pets." "He is not here, Mr. Robert," he replied, and ashed into an ashtray he held in his other hand, yet another overly formal mannerism. He gestured at the entire room. "But I've brought you here to meet his fish. You may already know that they are not particularly legal. This one here," he pointed at a whiskered creature over 2 feet long with a golden undulating body glimmering in the light. "This one here is an Asian Arowana, a dragonfish, very endangered in the wild. They're supposed to bring good luck, keep evil away, bring the family together. Asians always love believing in that. Our clients will pay over $10,000 for a gold one like this." He glanced at me for a response. I gave him nothing. His arrogance with all this was confusing, but more than anything was beginning to annoy me. He watched the fish intently. "You've heard of a caliche?" he said with his back to me. "It's a dense bed of calcium carbonate in the desert soil, harder than concrete. They must often use special drills to remove it from the ground. Because of caliche, my father spent a fortune building all this. Being underground, you see, that's very important to him. He comes down here 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes for an entire day, to smoke and listen to music, to be alone with his fish, remove himself entirely from the world. For all his flaws, my father is a man who values peace." "Maybe he just values a nice hiding place," I said. "A person can hide anywhere, Mr. Robert," he said, "even right out in the open. You do, don't you? How long could you stand it down here all alone, with nowhere to hide, with no one but you and yourself?" I took a step toward him and heard the Mexican shuffle his feet behind me. I spoke to Junior's back. "I've met your fish. Why else have you brought me here?" He turned around, expelling smoke through his nostrils. "I've brought you here to tell you a story. He licked his lips and brushed ash from his breast. You see, my father appreciates these fish because they are beautiful and they bring him a lot of money. But they also remind him of home. They bring home to him. It's the irony, you see, that's valuable. A tiny tropical ocean here in the middle of the desert, all these fish swimming beneath sand. The casinos in the city sell you a similar kind of irony, but what we have here is genuine and real because it also keeps us who we are. Who you are, I said. You and your pops run a Japanese restaurant. Be quiet, Mr. Robert, and listen. He put out his cigarette and walked over to take a seat in one of the dolphin chairs. He grabbed the remote off the table and pressed a button, and the music faded into the soft purr of the aquarium pumps. Unbuttoning his jacket, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, he offered me the face of a boy, but sounded like an old man. 20 years ago, he said, my parents and I escaped Vietnam by boat. 90 people in a little fishing boat made for maybe 20. We were headed for Malaysia. On our sixth night at sea, we hit a terrible storm and my mother fell overboard. No one saw it. It was too dark and stormy and the waters were too violent for anyone to save her anyway. I was 7 at the time. I will not bore you with the tragedy. I will only say that her death hardened my father, made him more fearless than he already was. In any case, after 9 days, our boat finally made it to the refugee camp in Malaysia on a deserted island off the coast. The first day my father and I were there, a few ruffians in the camp made themselves known to us. My father was once in a gang back in Vietnam, and he'd also fought in the war, so he wasn't afraid. He ignored them. A week later, one of them stole my rice ration. He slapped me several times, pushed me to the ground, ripped the sack out of my hand. For one last scare, he grabbed my wrist and ran a knife across it, barely cutting the skin. I ran to my father, bawling, and before he said a single word, he too slapped me, shut me up in an instant. Junior peered at his hands for a moment like he was studying his nails. His sudden sincerity felt real, except I couldn't locate its purpose. He went on. He took me by the arm and dragged me to the part of the camp where the ruffians hung out, near the edge of the forest. There was hardly anyone around except 3 young men kneeling and playing dice outside their hut. One of them was the man who had attacked me. My father made me point him out, then had me stand under a palm tree. He ordered me to watch. On a tree stump nearby, someone had butchered an animal and left the bloody cleaver. And my father grabbed it and marched up behind the man and kicked him hard in the back of the head. The man fell forward, dazed, and his 2 friends pounced at my father, but he was already brandishing the cleaver. They backed off. My father grabbed the man by the back of his shirt and dragged him to the tree stump. In one swift motion, he placed the man's hand on the stump and threw down the cleaver and hacked off 3 fingers. The man screamed. Suddenly there were voices around us, faces appearing in doorways. From behind trees, I heard a woman shriek. The man was kneeling on the ground, stunned and whimpering, clasping his bloody hand to his chest. His fingers, the 3 middle ones, still lay on the tree stump. His 2 fingers, his 2 friends, could only stare at them. My father flung the cleaver away and bent down and muttered something in his ear. Then he wiped his own hand on his pants and held mine as we walked back to our shack. We stayed in that camp for 3 more months before we came to the States. No one ever bothered us again. Sonny Jr. stood from the chair and walked over again to the stingrays. He took out the linen napkin and wiped the glass where his finger had pointed at the Arowana. I still occasionally have dreams about that afternoon, he said, as if to the fishes. Then he turned to me thoughtfully. But I'm not telling you this story so that you'll pity me. I simply want you to understand what kind of man my father is. I want you, in your own way, to respect it. He will hurt you, Mr. Robert. If he doesn't do it this time, he will find you some other time and hurt you then, no matter what. So please think of this conversation, this situation between us, as an exchange of trust. I've brought you down here, an officer of the law, to see my father's illegal business. This rather foolish gesture should convince you of my good intentions. Please trust that I'm trying to help you. I'm offering you the door now and trusting you to forget your plans in this city, to go home and not say a word of what you have seen. A man of your sentiments should appreciate the sincerity of this offer. I watched him neatly fold the napkin and place it back in his pocket. His fastidiousness seemed overdone, just like his words. He'd both shown me his hand and told me how to play mine, but it all still smelled like a bluff. The kid knew he was smart, and in my experience, if you let people think they're smarter, they'll try a little less to outsmart you. Easier said than done, though. I walked over to the couch and sat down. I hadn't smoked since Susie left me, another part of my detox plan, since smoking together was one of the few things we never stopped doing. But now I took a cigarette from the pack and lit up. I squinted up at him. "Why do you want so badly to help me?" I said. "Is it really me you're protecting? Or is it your father? Because somehow I feel he's no longer the hard man you say he is. Maybe never was. And I'm guessing maybe you made up that dramatic little story just to scare me. But even if it's true, I've dealt with scarier people. Now, why you've chosen to show me all this fish stuff is still a mystery to me, though I'd wager you just like getting off on your own smarts and impressing people. You've either read too many books or listened to people who've read too many books. Either way, it's not my fault that I can't understand half the things you say. But what I do understand is this." I leaned forward on the couch. "Your father is a thug. Not only that, he's a coward. He threw a woman down the stairs and broke her arm. Who knows what else he did or could have done or might do in the future, but men like him only have the guts to do that to a woman. You're a smart boy. You know I'm right. He's your father and you want to protect him. That's fine. It's admirable. But my business with him has nothing to do with you." I stood from the couch and walked around this table, stopping a few yards from him. "I'd tell you to fuck off, but that would be rude. I will say that I have police buddies who know exactly where I am and who your father is, and if I don't say hi to them next week, they'll know where to come find me." I took a long drag from the cigarette, flicked it on the ground. "I want to speak with your father. That's it. All the rest of this doesn't mean a whole lot of shit to me." Junior glared at my cigarette on the floor, still curling smoke, then at me. I couldn't tell if he believed me or saw through my empty threat. From behind him, the stingray swam languidly around his thin, stiff figure like a flock of vultures. His eyes looked past me, and he nodded before I could turn. Excuse me, let me say that again. His eyes looked past me, and he nodded, and before I could turn, I felt the Mexican's meaty arms clasp around me, crushing my chest so I could hardly breathe. My feet left the floor, my body seeming to spin like the ceiling fans above me, and I felt a fumbling at my ankle holster, and soon saw Sonny Jr. with my 5-shot, which he deposited in his jacket pocket. He said something in Vietnamese, and the Mexican shoved me to the floor, forcing me flat onto my stomach. With his knee digging into my lower back, he twisted one of my arms behind my shoulder and held the other to the floor before my flattened face. I could do nothing but grunt beneath him, a doll in his hands, the tile floor numbing my cheek. I looked up and Sonny Jr. had taken off his jacket. From his pant pocket, he now pulled out a switchblade, which he opened. The Mexican wrenched my extended forearm so that my wrist was exposed. Junior kneeled and planted his shoe on my palm. He steadied the blade across my wrist. "Wait," I gasped. I struggled but could hardly budge under the Mexican and his boulder of a knee. Junior slowly dragged the blade. I could feel its icy sharpness slice the surface of my skin. It was like a crawling itch, not yet painful, but my jaw clenched so tightly that it ached. He lifted his shoe. A line of blood appeared across my wrist, swelled. I suddenly saw Junior's open palm beside my face. He pulled back his sleeve and revealed the thin, pale scar, like a bracelet around his wrist. "You and I," he murmured, "now share something." He wiped the blade twice on my sleeve, closed it, and returned it to his pocket. He stood and I could no longer see his face, but his voice came out bitter and hard, like he was shaking his head at me. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Robert. The minute you arrived at our door, I knew. You are a man who has nothing to lose, but that does not make you brave, it makes you stupid. Happy told me you were a foolish man. What were you going to do, kill my father? Break his arm? Yell at him? Everything I've told you is true, and I meant every sentiment. yet you are too sentimental to listen. You want to come here and be a hero and save your former wife from a bad man. You want to know how he has hurt her and why. But in the end, the only thing you really want to know is why she would leave you for slapping her and then stay with a man who threw her down a staircase. Robert had slapped Susie in an argument that basically ended up bringing about their divorce, though they had other problems. The cut on my wrist was deeper than I had thought. I could feel the sting sharpening, the skin breaking as I bent my wrist and blood dribbled down my arm. Junior's shoes reappeared before my eyes, a foot from my nose. He was now speaking directly over my head like he was ready to spit on it. Do you know why fish swim in schools? To protect themselves, to move more easily, to find food and a mate. Now, who do they choose to swim with? Their own kind, those they resemble most. Why do you think nearly every casino dealer in this city is Asian, and nearly every Asian dealer is Vietnamese? Because we enjoy cards and colorful chips? No, because we flock to each other. We flock to where there are many of us so that we will belong and survive. It is a very simple reality, Mr. Robert, a primal reality. He bent down, speaking closer to my ear. What made you think she ever belonged to you, or that you ever belonged with her? You call her Susie, but her name is home. It's always been and always will be home. America, Mr. Robert, is not the melting pot you Americans like to say it is. It's oil and water. Things get stirred, sure, but they eventually separate and settle, and the like things always go back to each other. They've made new friends, perhaps even fucked them, but in their heart they will always return to where they belong. Love has absolutely nothing to do with it. He sighed loudly and stood back up. That's enough. I'm tired of speeches. He lifted his shoe above my head and stomped on my hand with the heel. I screamed out. The Mexican dismounted me. After a long, writhing moment, I forced myself to sit up. I held my injured hand like a dead bird. I couldn't tell if anything was broken, but my knuckles and fingers felt hot with pain, enough to distract me from my aching shoulder and my wrist, now smeared wet with blood. Junior pulled out the linen napkin again and tossed it at my feet, then handed the Mexican my gun. He wandered back to the piranha tanks, snug in his jacket again and with his hands in his pockets. As if ordering a child, he said to me, "If I ever see you again, I will do much worse. You will now go with Menendez here. He will take you back outside. Remember, you have seen nothing here. If necessary, I will hurt my new mother at your expense. I like her, but not that much." He nodded, and the Mexican led me out of the room by the arm, gently this time. Junior's voice crooned behind me, "Go home, Mr. Robert, and try to be happy." As I held my left hand wrapped in the napkin, the Mexican ushered me to another door, which revealed another staircase, which ascended into an office identical to the last one, except we stepped this time out of a painting of cranes flying over a rice paddy. The office opened into the pet store next door to the restaurant. We walked down the dark aisles, passing the droning aquariums and the bird cages, and then the dog pens, where weary shadows stirred inside, their dry whimpers following us to the front entrance. Deep in the store, something squawked irritably. I was released outside into a rainy, windy night. It was like stepping into another part of the country, far from the desert, near the ocean. I must have looked at Menendez with shock because he said, in a gruff but pleasant voice, "Monsoon season." He handed me my 5-shot, closed the door, and I saw his giant shadowy figure fade back into the darkness of the store. Thank you.